So this video is called Frank's Ether Moving Goalposts, and the emphasis is still on ether, which I've dealt with in other videos, but I'm now explaining some of the moving goalposts that have happened with ether after Einstein. The method of science/physics is to keep moving the goalposts, i.e. keep making changes. And when you talk to some of them, they think that's a good thing because you are changing your views based on new evidence. But what you're really doing is completely making a mess of things if you're not accurately saying what you've changed and why you've changed. So what you've got is a lot of moving goalposts in Einstein's relativity. And one facet of that is wordplay. So I'm taking up the issue here of wordplay with ether. Ether is also spelt the other way, with A-E-T-H-E-R or as E-T-H-E-R. And the basic idea behind that is that light wave has a medium. Now, Einstein in 1905 seems to be discarding the ether, and I've dealt with that in other videos. But after him came others working on relativity, and of course they're going to make a mess of things. More of a mess. What some of them seem to do is keep the ether but just change its name, hence you're dealing with wordplay. So I'm now going to look at this physicist Frank that seems to make a mess of the ether idea. This is Philip Frank, and he was an Austrian-born physicist, mathematician and philosopher. So this is what Wikipedia says about him. In 1907, Frank wrote an important paper on causality. Einstein was impressed by Frank's ideas, which he put forward in his paper, and the resulting discussions led to another lifelong friendship, this time between Frank and Einstein. Both loved the philosophy of science, and the ideas of each would influence the other. So you've got Einstein, and he has been influenced by other people, and this is one of his friends who's also on the relativity idea. So now going to look at his book. This is his book, Foundations of Physics. So initially I'm going to interpret what Frank says as moving goalposts, where he's done wordplay with the term ether. However, he is not interpreting what he's doing as playing word games. Hence, it is more complicated than that. Instead, he seems to be interpreting what he's doing is replacing the ether frame by the fundamental frame, though he's not explicitly stating that. So the first step I'm doing is I'm interpreting what he's doing as wordplay, and then I'll have to bring in the complications. So this is what the book says when it gets onto the theory of relativity. Einstein's two basic principles. Newton's mechanics was applied to to a hypothetical medium, the ether, which was supposed to fill up the whole world space. The wave motion in this ether was interpreted as being responsible for what appears to our sense observations as phenomena of light. The ether theory of light treats these waves according to Newton's laws of motion. The first result of this theory is that in empty space the waves of light are propagated with a speed 3 times 10 to the power 10 centimeters per second with respect to the ether. It means with respect to the ether frame, and really that 3 times 10 to the power 10 centimeters per second is only an approximation. The speed of the source of light has no influence upon this speed of propagation. This result can also be formulated without speaking of the ether. One proceeds in a way which is similar to the replacing of Newton's absolute space by the inertial system. And several points I should point out here. When you don't talk about the ether, I say well, it's still there, just unacknowledged. And it's making a point here that when Newton talks about motion in terms of at least absolute space, etc., now in Newton's relativity is going to talk about motion in terms of it being relative to inertial frames. And as Frank's book carries on to say, we say that in empty space the waves of light are propagated with a speed c relative to a certain fundamental system S. So his fundamental system he's talking about is a preferred frame, really, and that's an ether frame, in other words. So what he's talking about is fundamental system, or better, fundamental frame is really a type of ether frame. So he's introduced an ether frame, but thinks he can get away with that by giving it a different name. And what he's going to do is he's renamed the ether frame, but he's going to go on and deny the ether theory. The book says in 1905 Einstein dropped both assumptions, with the assumptions being Newtonian mechanics and the ether theory of light. His new theory of light and motion retained Newton's laws only for a limited class of motions, which obviously follow these. So he thinks calling ether a fundamental system, he can get away with using the ether. And I disagree with his belief of Newton for limited class of motions. That is a misinterpretation of Einstein's 1905 paper on special relativity, and I dealt with that in other videos. The maths, I would argue, for this renamed ether frame is what Einstein uses when he denies ether. See my other videos on that. However, unfortunately, Frank's math is going to be different to what Einstein has in his 1905 paper. So Einstein has an ether frame in his 1905 paper, but he's not acknowledging he has an ether frame, and that math is going to be different to what Frank uses as the maths for his fundamental frame. So first I'm going to take up the issue of the words being used. There's an issue with Frank's maths that will also have to be dealt with afterwards. However, Frank's wordplay and moving goalposts doesn't seem to be taken up by others. The book was written in 1965, and he moved the goalposts in that book from what Einstein was talking about in 1905, and the goalposts have moved again since. Either the goalposts were moved from what Frank was saying, or when Frank moved the goalpost, that was ignored by everybody else. So it's unfortunate. One of the tricks is to deny a concept, X, if you call it X for unknown, but give it a different name, Y, and then say Y exists but X doesn't. Politics is littered with such tricks, and so is physics. However, that being said, could define ether frame as dealing with a certain set of maths, and the fundamental frame as dealing with a different set of maths. That has not been done in Frank's book. The maths of Frank's fundamental frame is not the same as the maths that would be commonly given for the ether frame. So now not only is it moving goalposts for the words, it's also moving goalposts on the maths. However, he is not thinking of it in those terms, and have to go to what he says. So this is what he says. In 1905, Einstein dropped both assumptions, Newtonian mechanics and the ether theory of light. His new theory of light and motion retained Newton's laws only for a limited class of motions, which obviously follow these laws. These are the motions with small velocities. This means velocities which are small in comparison to the velocity of light. Troubles arise only if the speed of material bodies approaches the speed of light. Further, Einstein retained two results of the ether theory of light which are made plausible by experiments, but he regarded these results as straight generalizations of experimental facts without troubling about whether they could be derived from the ether theory of light or from Newton's laws of motion. So focusing on the last bit of this, that is an interesting interpretation by Frank, but there's nothing in Einstein's 1905 paper on special relativity about anything about that. So what Frank is doing is placing his own personal interpretation onto this paper, and he's trying to deal with things that Einstein left unsaid. Surely that is more moving goalposts. And also I pointed out that this is English translation of Einstein's 1905 paper has been mistranslated. But putting that issue aside, Frank says Einstein's two hypotheses or principles are: first, the speed of light relative to any room is independent of the speed of the source of light relative to this room. And he's calling that the principle of the constancy of light velocity. And the second hypothesis is the propagation of light relative to the walls of a moving room is determined by the initial conditions relative to this room, provided that the motion of this room is rectilinear and uniform motion relative to the fundamental system S, and that's the principle of relativity. What he interprets as the principle of relativity, and the fundamental system S, you could say, is a fundamental frame. So this is Frank's version, stroke interpretation of Einstein's two postulates. I've complained about these postulates many times, but putting that issue aside, note the use of fundamental system, which can easily call fundamental frame. It's not a term used by Einstein in 1905, and it's a term from which Frank wants to understand relativity from. Frank says the following: this principle can also be formulated as a statement about the impossibility of performing a certain set of operations. If our room has the speed v relative to s being the fundamental frame or system, it says that there is no physical experiment by which we can measure this quantity v, i.e. the expression speed of a room relative to the fundamental system or frame has no operational meaning. So what he's saying is you can't measure the speed v relative to the fundamental frame s. So if this fundamental frame is really just the ether frame, he deals with it in an unusual way, i.e. by not being able to measure speed v relative to it. And that's contrary to how one should normally be dealing with an ether frame, and that might justify why I don't call it an ether frame, ? So we could say that a fundamental frame is a frame where you can't measure the speed v relative to it, but an ether frame you could measure the speed v relative to it. For speed v greater than 0, I can't have it relative to the fundamental system stroke frame, and that doesn't really make much sense. If you've got a speed and you can't measure it, well, it doesn't make sense. Now, as pointed out in my video, Magic of Einstein Ether, Einstein is using an ether frame, just not saying that he's using an ether frame when he forms the equations. And you can see those equations there, where he's using c minus v and c plus v, and v is allowed to be greater than 0, and there's nothing said by Einstein that can't measure v. Einstein's unacknowledged ether frame becomes Frank's fundamental frame with the add-on in Frank's fundamental frame that can't measure v, and that is just piling on the nonsense. Einstein doesn't say anything about you can't measure v. Frank thereon makes no sense. Frank's fundamental frame, however, seems to have not been taken up by others, i.e. not part of what is generally taught. So Frank's nonsense is just a dead end no one else took up, because the relativity believers went in other nonsensical directions. And so my conclusion is Einstein makes a mess of things by using an unacknowledged ether frame and other things, but others who take up Einstein's ideas instead of tidying up that mess are often able, like Frank, to turn things into a bigger mess. Thank you. That's the end of this one.